It's so interesting. I'm not even going to share today why you can have a wilderness experience, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the results of a wilderness experience. It's such a beautiful thing that can come forth if you use your wilderness experience to the glory of God. Now I want to go back to Israel. God never planned for Israel to be in the wilderness for 40 years. They've gone to the city of Canaan. They explored that city for 40 days, but they couldn't see themselves beyond a grasshopper mentality. Now let's look at the grasshopper. What does a grasshopper do? It destroys everything in front of it, especially when it's a multitude. If there's a mass of grasshoppers and they go through a field, there's nothing left. It looks like a desert. And Israel saw themselves as grasshoppers. They couldn't embrace that fullness that God was planning for them. So what did they do? They drew back and said, no, we cannot take this fruitfulness. The fruitfulness cannot be ours. And because they couldn't embrace God and His fullness, they had to go back into the wilderness for 40 years. Now I'm going to read Numbers 14, verse 20 and verse 34. And the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. Moses, you've asked me for pardon. You've asked me for grace for this nation. I'm going to give it to the nation because you've asked it from me. And that's why you can ask God to pardon somebody else. You cannot take their sin on you, but you can ask God for His pardon. After the number of days in which you spied out the land of Canaan, even 40 days, for each day a year shall you bear and suffer for your iniquities, even for 40 years. And you shall know my displeasure, the revoking of my promise and my estrangement. God said, because you couldn't hear, you're going to go back into the desert. But let's look, what was the results of that desert experience? The result of that desert experience was the tabernacle. If they immediately went into Canaan, they never would have had the tabernacle. And we would not know the blueprint of heaven. We would have missed that. Because they went into the desert for 40 years, they received the tablets. Because they were in the desert for 40 years, Moses had that tent of meeting with God. And that is so amazing. During that 40 years, they experienced God's grace. They experienced God's leading. They experienced God's provision. They haven't exchanged their shoes or their clothing. It never worn out. They've experienced that fullness of God. Why? Because their focus were on God. Their focus was supposed to be on God. Whenever their focus was taken away, people died. Each person who took their focus off God died in the desert. But the two men that were focused on God, Cain and Joshua. Joshua and Caleb. No. The two men that were listening to God, they stayed to see the promised land. Why? They had their focus on God. They were focusing on God. And because of that, they could embrace the fullness of God. Now, when you have a desert experience, a wilderness experience, don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't say, oh, it's so bad. It cannot work for me. Look for those small gems that God is giving you. Because those small gems will be the gems that will take you through the next period of time. It's those small gems that God has given you during your desert experiences that will lead you, guide you, and that will be the faith that God will give you. Let me give you a testimony. Years ago, I was working in a secular environment, and something happened, and I immediately resigned. And eventually I said to them, okay, I will do it the right way. And I resigned, and I gave them 6 weeks notice. I had nowhere to go, and I needed the finances. But during that 6 weeks of wilderness experience that I had, God provided, and He gave me a new place to work, a new job with better circumstances, where He actually had better things for me to do. And I had a wider audience to work with, if I can use it. Yes, God promoted me in my new environment within 3 months to a senior position. Sometimes God needs to take you through a wilderness experience so you can let go of the old and grab hold of the new. What is it that has brought you into this wilderness experience? Was it a wrong attitude? Or was it led by God? If we look at Jesus, Jesus never had a wrong attitude. But in Matthew 4 verse 1 we read, then Jesus was led, He was guided by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness, the desert, to be tempted, tested and tried by the devil. Now if you read that portion of the Bible in perspective, you will see that Jesus wasn't tempted while He was fasting. He was in the wilderness for 40 days. And after his 40 days, Satan started to tempt Him. And what happened during that 40 days? He was settled in the Holy Spirit. Just before he went into the wilderness, he was baptized, and the Holy Spirit led him into the wilderness. Don't always blame Satan for being in the wilderness. Sometimes God has placed you there to give you some gems, to give you some faith, to hold on to say, I have placed you in this position. Nobody else. And before you're not going to see that it's God that placed you there, you will never fully grasp the fullness of your wilderness experience. In your wilderness time, there will be quietness. There will be no other voices that's influencing you. In that wilderness experience, you will learn to focus on God and see God's heart. In your wilderness experience, you will experience the quietness in your spirit so that you can identify the fullness of God's heart again. Don't despise the times of wilderness. Embrace that, because then you will identify the places of gathering with God. You will find the gems of His voice again. You will experience the peace of God. And He will give you those gems that you can take with you in the next season of your life. A wilderness experience is not bad. Don't despise it. Don't throw it in the bin. Don't complain about it. You can be there because of disobedience. You can be there because God led. Whatever way, embrace the wilderness and ask the Lord to give you those gems. Ask Him that He will show you where the gems are. If you miss the gems, you will miss your next season. the anchors of your next season. After I resigned from that position, was placed in another position, and it was during that time, because of obedience, that I found the gems of God's faith. I've learned during that time what it is to really rest in God and to know what it is to move on God's faith. In the short period that I had a wilderness experience just now, God opened a new door. And I saw a new door opening in heaven. And it was so beautiful. There were so many things to explore. And I'm still walking into that door, learning what to do with a new gem. A wilderness experience is not bad. Clench your ears. Ask the Lord to clench your hearing. See with God's eyes. Hear and feel God's heart. Because the wilderness is a place of quietness. Rest in God. Guidance and leading of the Holy Spirit. Yes, you're going to be tempted afterwards. But do you know what? Those temptations is then just a grain of sand that's easily to be conquered. Why? Because you received the gem of God. May the wilderness experience that you're going through now be a time of so much joy, so much love, so much guidance, and you will see, if you can embrace that, a new door of God's glory and God's fullness will step in. And you will be able to go through things, new doors that only God could have opened for you. I bless you today with your wilderness experience. I bless you today with a new vision. I bless you today with a quietness in your spirit. And may the wilderness be the fullness that God is implanting, strengthening in your heart.